The building is worth $400 million, and the man who owns it did not build it. He bought it in 2011 for $62 million out of bankruptcy, while everyone around him said retail real estate was dead. 10 years later, that same mall generates over $30 million a year in rent from stores most of us have never thought twice about walking into. This is not a story about shopping. It is a story about a bet and what happens when a landlord understands something the rest of us never notice. A shopping mall is not a place that sells things. It is a place that sells space, and the person who owns that space can make more money than half the businesses operating inside it. To understand how that works, you have to go back to the beginning, before the stores, before the food court, before a single shopper ever walked through the doors. Every mall starts the same way, with a piece of land and a very large, very risky loan. A large regional mall, the kind with 2 or 3 anchor stores and over 1 million square feet of leasable space, can cost anywhere from $200 million to over $1 billion to build, depending on the era, the market, and how ambitious the developer feels that year. Land in a desirable suburban location can eat $50 to $100 million before anyone breaks ground. Construction itself, depending on finishes and climate systems, often runs well over $100 per square foot. And this is before parking, before permits, before the environmental studies that can stall a project for years. So where does that money actually go once the mall opens its doors? Not into merchandise, not into staff. It goes into something far less visible and far more permanent: relationships with a handful of enormous retail chains who don't pay rent the way everyone else does. Here is the part almost nobody outside the industry knows. In some of the older classic mall developments, the big department stores, names like Macy's, Nordstrom, or JCPenney, were offered extraordinarily cheap deals to move in, sometimes owning their own building outright, sometimes paying rent so low it barely covered taxes. That was not generosity, it was bait. Once a Macy's opens its doors, it pulls thousands of shoppers past every smaller store lining the hallway on the way there. The developer isn't renting to Macy's for Macy's sake. He's renting to Macy's so he can charge triple the price per square foot to the shoe store next door, because now that shoe store gets free foot traffic it could never afford to buy on its own. Which raises an obvious question. If the anchor barely pays rent, where does the mall's real money come from? It comes from a mechanism most shoppers have never heard of, called percentage rent. A smaller tenant, a clothing shop or an electronics store, pays a base rent every month, but the lease also includes a clause. Once that store's sales cross a certain threshold, the landlord takes a cut of everything above it. So when a store has a record-breaking holiday season, the landlord's income goes up too, without hiring a single employee or selling a single product. The mall owner becomes a silent partner in thousands of businesses at once, profiting from their best days without sharing any of their worst. And then there's the food court, which quietly became one of the most profitable pieces of real estate in the entire building. A 200-square-foot stall selling orange chicken can, in some malls, be leased at a premium well above what a full clothing retailer pays for the same footprint, because hungry, tired shoppers make impulsive decisions, and impulsive decisions are exactly what a landlord wants to charge for. By now, the mall looks like a machine that prints money. Rent from anchors, rent from inline stores, a cut of their best sales, a premium on food, plus common area fees tenants pay for cleaning and security, plus advertising space, plus parking in denser urban locations. On paper, this building should be unstoppable.
So what actually goes wrong? The first crack usually isn't visible from inside the mall at all. It shows up on a loan document. Almost no one buys or builds a mall of this size with cash. The debt is refinanced every 5 to 10 years, and when interest rates rise, that refinancing suddenly costs millions more per year than it used to, even if every single store in the building is doing exactly the same business it did last year. A mall can have full occupancy, happy tenants, and still slide toward trouble purely because the cost of the debt sitting underneath it just changed. The second crack is slower and far more dangerous because it starts with something that looks like good news: a store closing. When an anchor department store shuts down, and department stores have been closing at an alarming rate over the past 15 years, it does not just remove one tenant. It removes the entire reason thousands of people were walking through that wing of the building every week. Sales at nearby stores can collapse within months. And buried in many leases is a clause called co-tenancy, which allows smaller tenants to legally pay reduced rent or walk away entirely once vacancy in the mall crosses a certain percentage. One empty department store can trigger a chain reaction that guts an entire wing within 18 months. Industry insiders have a name for what happens next. They call it the death spiral. And once it starts, it is brutally difficult to stop. This is exactly what happened to Rolling Acres Mall in Akron, Ohio. It opened in 1975 as a thriving property, anchored by major department stores, full of shoppers on a Saturday afternoon. By the 2000s, anchors began closing one by one. Smaller tenants left as foot traffic dried up. Within a decade, the mall that once anchored an entire community had become an internet symbol of American urban decay, an empty concrete shell, eventually demolished. Nobody planned for that outcome the day it opened. It happened because ownership kept waiting for the traffic to come back, instead of asking what the building needed to become next. Which brings us back to that owner in 2011, the one who bought his mall for $62 million out of bankruptcy. He was not buying a shopping center. He was buying a bet that the mall business itself was about to change, and that the winners would not be the ones with the most clothing stores, but the ones willing to stop being a mall at all. Compare that to what happened 80 miles away at American Dream in New Jersey, a $5 billion development that took over a decade to open, partly because its owners kept redesigning what it should even be. What eventually opened was barely a traditional shopping center. It's a hybrid, indoor ski slope, water park, amusement rides, and aquarium, with retail wrapped around the entertainment rather than the other way around. Two properties, two very different bets, built on the same basic realization. Shopping alone can no longer justify the square footage. The mall that survives now has to give people a reason to leave their couch that a phone in their hand cannot replicate.
That reason is not entirely rational, and it's worth understanding why it works at all. Physical shopping offers something online retail structurally cannot. Trying on the jacket before you buy it, smelling food cooking 2 stores away, running into someone you know. Psychologists have studied this under the term retail therapy, and while the popular idea of a guaranteed dopamine hit oversimplifies the neuroscience, there's real evidence that physical, sensory shopping environments encourage impulse purchases in a way scrolling a web page does not. Mall architects have leaned into this for decades. Some mall designs deliberately minimize clocks and exterior windows, a principle loosely tied to what's known in retail design circles as the Gruen transfer, named after Victor Gruen, the architect credited with inventing the modern mall, who spent much of his later life criticizing what his own invention had become. It is not a guaranteed formula for spending more money, but it is a deliberate design philosophy, and it has shaped almost every large mall built since the 1960s. Now here's where the real math comes in, because the biggest number in this entire story is also the most misleading one if you don't unpack it. Take a mid-size, well-located regional mall, 800,000 square feet, 92% occupancy, average rent across anchors and inline tenants blended at roughly $30 per square foot. That alone produces gross rental income north of $20 million a year. Add percentage rent from strong-performing tenants, food court premiums, common area fees, and parking revenue in dense locations, and total revenue can climb toward $30 to $35 million. That sounds like a business printing money. But subtract property taxes, which on a property this size can run several $1 million annually. Subtract insurance, utilities across 1 million square feet of climate-controlled space, ongoing maintenance, and the renovation budget that never really ends, because a mall that looks dated in 10 years stops pulling foot traffic no matter how good the numbers looked the year before. What's left, the net operating income, might land somewhere between $12 and $18 million. Respectable. But now subtract debt service on whatever loan financed the purchase or the construction, and depending on how leveraged the deal was, the actual free cash flow reaching the owner's pocket can be a fraction of that original $35 million headline number. This is why most malls today aren't owned by individuals at all, but by real estate investment trusts, structures built specifically to spread this kind of risk across dozens of properties instead of betting everything on one. The mistakes that sink mall owners almost always trace back to the same instinct, assuming the past will repeat itself. Owners who kept raising rent on struggling tenants through the 2010s, betting that demand would eventually bounce back, watched those tenants close their doors instead of renewing their leases. Owners who skipped renovations because the property was still profitable on paper woke up 5 years later having lost both their anchors and their relevance at the same time. And, less obviously, some owners made the opposite mistake. They diversified so aggressively into entertainment and mixed-use space that the property lost the retail identity that made it recognizable in the first place, chasing survival so hard they forgot what made people show up. So what actually separates the malls quietly generating tens of millions a year from the ones sitting half-empty, waiting for a wrecking ball? It is rarely the number of stores. It is whether the person holding that $400 million loan understood early enough that they were never really in the business of selling clothes, food, or electronics. They were in the business of selling a reason to show up. The owners who figured that out turned dying department stores into gyms, offices, apartments, and entertainment anchors that Amazon could never replicate. The owners who didn't are the ones whose buildings you've seen online, dark, empty, photographed by urban explorers as a kind of American ruin. The next time you walk through a mall that still feels alive, packed on a Saturday afternoon, look past the stores for a second. Somewhere behind that building sits a loan, a set of leases, and someone who bet a 9-figure sum on a very simple idea, that people will still pay to leave their house as long as you give them a reason worth leaving for.